Hi, folks. Here we are in the studio. I've got a nice little still life sort of 3D collage set up, and we're going to practice photographing using the manual camera app on Android. So I've got a tripod here. I am next to a nice bright window, so I've got good natural light. Let's go into the app and see some of the settings we have access to. So up along the top, I've got in the top left a button for the digital image format. Right now this is set to JPEG, but if I tap that, I could change to other formats like RAW. Next to that, I've got a grid button, so I can tap this and this will change the format of the display grid that sits over the image. So I could turn it off, I could set it to rule of thirds. This is pretty subtle to see, and that's good because then it doesn't get in the way of what's showing in the viewfinder. In the middle, I've got a flash icon, so I could turn the camera's flash on or off. I'm just going to leave that on auto, and we've got nice bright light here, so we shouldn't need a flash. I've got a timer, so if I wanted to click the shutter button and wait a duration and then have the exposure set automatically, I could do that. And then I've got a button to set which camera we're using. So that's the rear-facing one, this is the front-facing one. Now down at the bottom, this is where we're going to be setting our exposure controls. So this row of buttons, the smaller row above the one that looks like an aperture, starting from the left we've got white balance. So I can click there and I can set the white balance based on the type of light that I'm using. So in this case, I'd want this on either auto, or since I'm using natural light from the window, I'd want the daylight setting. So there's this one for daylight. And those should give me about the same results. Next to that, we've got the focus settings. So I could set AF for autofocus. I could go back, set the little flower icon for macro. That's when we're taking pictures relatively close up. And a couple other settings here. I'm going to leave this on macro because we are relatively close to our subject. We could also do a manual focus, and that would make it the most amount of control over what we're focusing on in our image. In the middle here, the little plus minus icon, that's where we can set our ISO and our shutter speed. Now this app doesn't actually allow us to set the f-stop or the aperture, so these are the two settings we'll have control of, and the app will automatically adjust the aperture for us as we make changes here. So my ISO setting, I want this relatively low. Right now it's on 100, so something like 55 or 100. That's going to give me a nice smooth image without a lot of grain in it. The slider here, I can set my shutter speed. So notice as I click and drag that, I get a different number in the center, and I'm also seeing different levels of brightness or darkness. So I think for this, something around 1/100th of a second or 1/50th of a second is going to work. One thing that we want to pay attention to, though, is we're trying to balance out the brights and the darks in this image. And so if I'm looking here, these flowers are probably around the darkest thing in the image, at least in the foreground. And then these white blocks are probably the brightest. So we're trying to get details out of both of those parts of the image. So we don't want the white blocks to be so bright that they're blown out and we lose detail. We don't want the dark flowers to be so dark that we can't see the individual petals. So by making adjustments to the shutter speed, we can help to get more or less detail in each of those areas. So I'll try this on 1/100th of a second, and of course that's going to change based on the lighting conditions, and if the sun goes behind a cloud, we might have to switch that later on. I've also got this little button here, this AEL button, and that lets me switch between manual mode and automatic mode. So right now this is activated in manual mode. If I click that button, I'd go to automatic mode. So once I've got my settings set, one additional thing I can do is to tap on the screen to different parts of the image, and I can see that I'm going to focus on different parts of my scene based on where I tap. So I'm thinking probably I want to make sure that I'm focused on those flowers, and maybe that's my focal point for this test version of the image, or maybe I want to tap on the two-dimensional collage that's sort of forming the base of this composition. Point is, wherever you want to focus your image, tap on it on the screen, and then we can click the shutter button. So that's this big one down here at the bottom. And I get the little shutter noise, and then there's my image. Okay, so that's an overview of how to use the manual camera app in Android.